I was thinking now we might move on, obviously, to talking more directly about the relationship, if you like, between Poland and Scotland. I would like to start by asking you what the main similarities were between Poland's relationship with Lithuania and Scotland's relationship with England.
Well, when I started looking at this, I thought that the parallels were very close, and I used to write and say that in both cases what you have is a union, political unions that began as loose personal or dynastic relationships and moved towards parliamentary real unions. The Poles and the Lithuanians in 1569, the English and the Scots in 1603, and then to a full parliamentary union in 1707. As I've investigated it closer, I think there are remarkable parallels, and these are the only two full parliamentary unions that were ever attempted in the early modern period. There was the Anglo-Irish Parliamentary Union of 1801, but that comes just outside my closing date of 1800. But nothing like this had ever been attempted in Europe. Most political unions were formed because the king of one place became the king of another place, and they were linked only by the person of the monarch. In both the English and Scottish cases and the Polish-Lithuanian cases, they came together to form a much closer union, and I'm interested in that process in both places. With regard to the differences, in many respects within the Polish-Lithuanian Union, Poland, which a lot of Poles and Scots today say there are great similarities between them. They both have large and aggressive neighbours. For the Poles, this means the Russians. For the Scots, it can mean the English. Except that within the context of the Union, Poland really forms or occupies the position of England in the Anglo-Scottish Union, and the Lithuanians are really the Scots. Yeah. Because in both cases, the culturally and politically dominant partner in one union was Poland, and the other union was England. In both cases, you see the cultural harmonization round language. The Scots end up speaking English rather than Scots or Gaelic. The Lithuanians, Lithuanian was not a written language until the 16th century. The elite of Lithuania carried out politics in the 15th century in Ruthenian, in Ruski, not in Lithuanian, because Ruski was a written language. And by the 17th century, the Lithuanian elite effectively speaks Polish. They've become Catholic, which is the religion from Poland. The Lithuanian church is heavily dependent, certainly in the early stages, on Polish-educated priests. So there are similarities, but it's the Lithuanians who are the Scots, not the Poles in this relationship.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the other things that had occurred to me, and I wanted to pick up with you, was that clearly when you look at the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, your first impression is that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is probably a mirror image of the Anglo-Scottish Union. I was wondering whether you might want to elaborate again a little bit on the practical results of this.
Well, the other great difference is a practical one. The Anglo-Scottish Union is much more centralised in terms of where political power lies than the Polish-Lithuanian Union. As I say, the Polish-Lithuanian Union forms itself as a decentralised system, or I would say actually an uncentralised system. They centralise their parliament, but as I say, the parliament is dependent upon the local sejmiks, who raise a lot of the taxes that are voted and who have to agree to the taxes that are voted. And they can collect them if they want, and sometimes they say, we don't want to collect those taxes. That creates a problem for the state when it comes up against powerful neighbours like Russia, Prussia and Austria in the 18th century, which leads ultimately to the partitions of the state at the end of the 18th century. The Anglo-Scottish Union, in contrast, medieval England is one of the most highly centralized political systems in Europe. And it's much more centralized in many respects than France. And when the Anglo-Scottish Union of the Parliaments takes place in 1707, effectively Scotland is incorporated into that Westminster-based system, which lies at the roots of some of the problems that the British system is having at the moment. It is a highly centralized system. Decisions are taken in London, in Westminster. The major decisions, the Scottish Parliament, which was unicameral, was wound up in 1707, and the Scots effectively became members of what was called the British Parliament, but it was effectively the English Parliament. That has created what, for many Scots in the late 20th and early 21st century, became a democratic problem. The number of Scottish MPs at Westminster was relatively small. Effectively, the English MPs decided, and much of that lies behind the whole campaign for a Scottish Parliament, i.e., should we devolve and have a system more like Poland and Lithuania, a decentralized system? Now, we're still having that conversation in the British Isles, but that's the major practical difference. The British went for a centralized system which has advantages in terms of state power. Poland and Lithuania went for decentralization and lost out in the end to more centralized, powerful rivals.
It would be interesting to hear what kind of relationship Lithuania had with Poland prior to the advent of the Commonwealth. I'm wondering, given what you've already said, it would appear certainly that, if you like, Lithuania almost acted as a type of bridge. You had a situation where the sort of Grand Dukes of Lithuania were promising something to one side, well, to the Poles it was, yes, we'll become Catholics, and Protestants in the other direction. But I'm also wondering, from a practical point of view, whether, as well as that sort of political brinksmanship that clearly went on and allowed Lithuania to maintain itself in some sense, whether there were times when there was aggression from Lithuania's neighbours which had to be dealt with. You mentioned the Teutonic Knights as well, obviously, but I'm wondering, from the Polish-Lithuanian perspective, whether there was aggression there.
There was nothing like the Anglo-Scottish relationship, in which famously Edward I claims that he is King of Scotland and that Scotland is a feudal dependency on England. There's nothing remotely like the constant Anglo-Scottish wars that last throughout much of the medieval period down deep into the 16th century, and which were one of the reasons why some Scots felt we had to have a union with England before 1603, because otherwise we're just going to end up like the Scottish football team, getting beaten every time we play, except for the occasional victory, like Bannockburn, which we go on about up here, partly because it's one of the few ones we won. Wembley 1967 is Bannockburn. The Lithuanian-Polish relationship was different. The Lithuanians were one of a number of pagan tribes on Poland's northeastern frontier. The Prussians were another. The Prussians were not always Germans. They were actually a Baltic people originally who spoke a language related to Lithuanian, and they were still pagan. That was the reason for having the Teutonic Knights up there. They were meant to convert them with the sword. But these tribes, the Prussians and the Lithuanians, raided extensively into Poland, deep into the 14th century. In fact, Jogaila, the Grand Duke who became King Władysław II of Poland in 1386, he was involved in at least one major raid on Poland in 1377. And one of the reasons for the union was in part to end those raids. From the Lithuanian point of view, they were having a problem if they're going to choose between the Orthodox East and that. I mean, I have very carefully called the power on their eastern border Muscovy, because the whole question of when Muscovy becomes Russia is a very difficult one, and there is a Russian interpretation of the history of Eastern Europe which says that effectively what is now Belarus and Ukraine are naturally part of Russia, which Ukrainians, as we know at the moment, and Belarusians, or at least many Ukrainians and Belarusians, contest. So that's why I talk about Muscovy. But Lithuania, as I've said, has a small pagan elite ruling a very large number of Orthodox Christians who speak Ruski. The language, the political language, as I've said, of the Grand Duchy was, by the end of the 14th century, Ruski. Jogaila's mother was an Orthodox Christian. The Lithuanian pagan nobility was very small. If the Lithuanians become Orthodox, if the Grand Duke of Lithuania becomes Orthodox, and Jogaila is made this offer just before the union with Poland, then he can see that Lithuanian will disappear. The Lithuanian language is not written down. You'll become just a Ruski-speaking Lithuania. And in fact, part of the reason for the union is so that the Lithuanian elite can separate themselves out culturally from the Ruthenian-speaking nobles and elites of the Grand Duchy and preserve Lithuanian identity. So in that sense, the union with Polish backing becomes a means for preserving a separate idea of Lithuania. And that's the reason why Lithuania, in my interpretation, is an independent state and a separate nation to this very day. Some Lithuanians might question that interpretation, but there we are.